The tranquil hum of the Ethelgard, flagship of the Galactic Concordant Armada, usually resonated with the calm efficiency of a well-oiled machine. But today, a nervous energy crackled through the corridors, a subtle tremor in the force of interspecies relations. This was the day the Terrans arrived. Humanity, hailing from the infamous death world, Earth, was about to be integrated into the Armada's peacekeeping forces. The briefing room held representatives from a dozen worlds, each species, adapted to environments far less enthusiastic than Earth. Xyler, a Xylarian officer known for his meticulous record-keeping and unflappable demeanor, qualities about to be severely tested. Adjusted his bioluminescent spectacles, he'd read the reports, of course. The endless reports detailing human physiology. Immune systems capable of fighting off bioweapons with the efficiency of a disposal unit, bone density that defied gravitational logic, and a pain threshold that seemed to operate on an entirely different scale. They are anomalous. Ambassador Flar, a wizened, glimmering one, had put it diplomatically during the initial discussions. Anomalous barely scratched the surface. They were a biological middle finger to the established galactic order, where evolution favored delicate adaptations over brute resilience. The Concordant Armada, built on principles of diplomacy and minimal force, was about to be introduced to a species that seemed to consider a plasma burn a minor inconvenience. The brass, blessed their collective naivete, had issued a preliminary set of guidelines. Xyler had glanced at them. They were laughably inadequate. In case of limb detachment, offer immediate medical assistance. As if a Terran wouldn't just shrug it off and try to reattach it with duct tape and sheer willpower, he sighed, a soft hiss of displaced atmosphere. This was going to be interesting. The root of this galactic imbalance lay in the very nature of life's cradle. For millennia, the concordant worlds had enjoyed an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity, largely due to the fortunate environments in which their species had evolved. Consider the Xylarians themselves, native to the temperate moon of Cygnus 7. Their bodies, delicate and attuned to the subtle harmonies of their homeworld, were ill-equipped for the harsh realities of space, let alone a planet like Earth. Their primary defense was their intellect, their ability to analyze and anticipate threats before they materialized. The glimmering ones, with their shimmering, bioluminescent bodies, hailed from a planet bathed in perpetual twilight, where competition was minimal and predators were virtually non-existent. Their strength lay in their wisdom, their capacity for empathy and understanding. The armored KRYLL, while physically imposing, had evolved in a tightly controlled ecosystem where natural disasters were rare and resources were plentiful. Their rigid social structure and adherence to protocol were products of a world that demanded order and predictability. These species and countless others formed the backbone of the Interstellar Peacekeeping Coalition, an organization dedicated to maintaining galactic harmony through diplomacy, trade, and, when necessary, carefully calibrated interventions. Their ships were designed for negotiation, their weapons for de-escalation, their protocols for minimizing casualties. They were, in essence, galactic gardeners, tending to the delicate ecosystem of sentient life. Then came humanity, a weed in the garden, a species forged in the crucible of a world that seemed actively hostile to its own existence, that a world where survival was not a right, but a constant, brutal struggle. And that struggle, it seemed, had made them different. Earth. The very name sent shivers down the spines of even the most seasoned xenobiologists. Its classification as a death world wasn't merely a bureaucratic label. It was a scientific understatement. The planet teemed with life, yes, but life that seemed engaged in a constant, merciless war against itself. Predators of unimaginable ferocity stalked the land, the seas, and even the skies. Natural disasters were commonplace, ranging from earthquakes that swallowed entire cities to storms that could scour continents clean. And then there were the diseases. Humanity, against all odds, had not only survived this gauntlet, but thrived. Their evolutionary journey had been a brutal, relentless selection process, favoring those who could endure the most extreme conditions. This had resulted in a species with a biological profile that bordered on the fantastical. Their immune systems, for instance, were legendary. They could shrug off alien pathogens that would dissolve a KRYLL warrior in seconds. Earthborne bacteria, viruses, and fungi had honed the human immune response to an almost absurd level of efficiency. Reports indicated that Terran medics often used common Earth-based antibiotics to treat alien ailments, with surprisingly effective results. Pain, for a human, seemed more like a suggestion than a debilitating force. Their nervous systems were wired to withstand levels of trauma that would render other species catatonic. They routinely sustained injuries that should have been fatal, only to patch themselves up with whatever was available and continue fighting. And their resilience, that was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all. They could survive starvation, dehydration, radiation exposure, and countless other environmental stressors that would quickly kill any other sentient species in the Concordant. They were, in essence, walking, talking embodiments of Darwinian survival, forged in the fires of a world that actively sought their extinction. And now, these survivors were about to join the ranks of the Interstellar Peacekeeping Coalition. What could possibly go wrong? The Shuttle Spirit of St. Louis, a decidedly archaic name according to Zeiler's research, docked with the Ethelgar with a pneumatic hiss that a ramp extended, and onto the pristine metal of the Coalition peacekeeping base strode the first contingent of Terran troops. They were underwhelming. Zeiler had expected something more imposing. These humans were, well, human. They were of varying heights and builds, clad in utilitarian gray uniforms that seemed designed for practicality rather than aesthetics. Their faces, while diverse, lacked the exotic features of many Coalition species, and no shimmering scales, no iridescent eyes, no elaborate cranial ridges. They simply looked ordinary. Yet, there was an undeniable air of confidence about them, but a certain swagger that seemed out of place in the sterile environment of the Ethelgard. They moved with a casual assurance, their eyes scanning the surroundings with a sharp, almost predatory alertness. Leading the group was a woman with close-cropped brown hair and a steely gaze. She introduced herself as Captain Eva Rostova, and her voice was surprisingly melodic despite its underlying firmness. Captain Rostova, Terran Expeditionary Force, reporting for duty. A wave of hushed whispers rippled through the assembled Coalition officers, curiosity mingled with apprehension. The KRYLL contingent stood ramrod straight, their armored faces betraying nothing, but Zeiler could sense their unease. The glimmering ones radiated a palpable sense of fascination. Zeiler stepped forward, adjusting his bioluminescent spectacles. Captain Rostova, welcome to the Ethelgard. I am Officer Zeiler, and I will be your liaison during your integration period. He offered a polite nod, trying to maintain a professional demeanor despite the nagging feeling that he was about to witness something truly extraordinary, or perhaps utterly disastrous. Rostova returned the nod, a faint smile playing on her lips. Pleased to meet you, Officer. Let's get to work. The incident occurred during a routine weapons familiarization exercise. The Terrans were being introduced to the standard-issue Concordant plasma rifle, a weapon designed for non-lethal peacekeeping operations. Its energy output was calibrated to stun or incapacitate, not to kill. Private Miller, a young Terran with a perpetually bored expression, was demonstrating proficiency with the rifle when a malfunction occurred. A surge of energy overloaded the weapon, causing a discharge that grazed his left arm. A thin line of seared flesh appeared, accompanied by the acrid smell of burning protein. The assembled Coalition officers gasped. The KRYLL medics rushed forward, their bioscanners already whirring. Zeiler felt a surge of adrenaline. A plasma burn, even a minor one, could be excruciatingly painful, potentially leading to shock and long-term tissue damage for most species. But Miller just blinked. He glanced down at his arm, a faint frown creasing his brow. That's gonna sting later. He flexed his arm a few times, as if testing its functionality. Then he picked up the plasma rifle again. The KRYLL medics froze, their antennae twitching in confusion. The glimmering ones murmured in disbelief. Zeiler stared, his bioluminescent spectacles nearly popping off his face. Private Miller, he stammered. "Are you all right?" Miller shrugged. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a little crispy. Can we get back to the exercise? I want to try that targeting system again." The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of the Ethelgard's life support systems. Zyler exchanged glances with Captain Rostova, who merely offered a knowing smirk. The initial shock was palpable. It was clear that the reports, the data, the briefings, they had all failed to adequately prepare the Coalition officers for the reality of Terran physiology. This was going to be a very long integration period in the wake of the plasma burn incident. The brass scrambled to address the glaring inadequacies of their initial integration protocols. The result was the first draft of the Emergency Guidelines for Dealing with Terran Troops, a document that quickly became the subject of much amusement and quiet desperation among the Coalition officers. Zyler reread the document, shaking his head. IT was filled with well-intentioned but utterly naive advice. In the event of injury, administer standard analgesic medication. As if standard analgesics would even register on a Terran's pain receptors, he recalled a Terran saying he'd heard in passing. "That's cute. If a Terran displays signs of aggression, attempt to de-escalate the situation through calm and rational communication." Zyler imagined trying to calmly reason with a Terran experiencing whatever passed for a Terran raged. He shuddered. The best, or worst, guideline was undoubtedly this. Terrans may exhibit unusual dietary habits. Avoid questioning their food choices unless they appear to be consuming hazardous materials. This, Zyler suspected, was a direct result of observing a Terran soldier dipping a nutrient-paste packet into a cup of what appeared to be industrial-grade solvent. The document also included gems like, "Do not be alarmed by loud vocalizations," which may simply be Terran expressions of camaraderie, and Terrans may engage in competitive activities that appear dangerous or illogical. Monitor these activities closely, but avoid interfering unless there's a clear and immediate threat of serious injury. Zyler highlighted a section titled Dealing with Minor Wounds. The first point read, "Offer immediate medical attention, even if the Terran claims to be uninjured." The second point, "If the Terran refuses medical attention, do not insist. They may have their own methods of treatment." The third point, added in hastily scrawled handwriting, "Under no circumstances allow the Terran to treat the wound with duct tape, lubricant gel, or any other item not explicitly approved by medical personnel." The guidelines were a joke, but a necessary one. They were a testament to the sheer incomprehensibility of Terran biology and behavior, and they were a clear indication that the Interstellar Peacekeeping Coalition was in way over its head. The self-medication mayhem, as Zyler later termed it in his official report, involved Private Jenkins, a Terran engineer with a penchant for tinkering and a seemingly pathological aversion to medical facilities. During a maintenance check on the Ethelgard's primary coolant system, Jenkins suffered a laceration to his hand, a consequence of a miscalibrated plasma wrench. The wound, while not life-threatening, was significant. IT required sutures, disinfectant, and a sterile bandage. The KRYL medics, alerted by the ship's sensors, arrived promptly with a medkit in tow. Jenkins, however, waved them off with a dismissive gesture. "I got this," he said, his voice muffled by a mouthful of something that looked suspiciously like engine grease. Ignoring the medic's protests, Jenkins proceeded to rummage through his toolbox, extracting a collection of items that sent shivers down Zyler's spine. There was a length of frayed wiring, a rusty bolt, a shard of broken ceramic plating, and a tube of multi-purpose lubricant. He then proceeded to clean the wound with the lubricant, wincing slightly as he scrubbed away the blood. Next, he used the frayed wiring to fashion a makeshift tourniquet, tightening it with a rusty bolt. Finally, he covered the wound with the shard of ceramic plating, securing it in place with a generous application of, well, Zyler wasn't entirely sure what it was, but it smelled vaguely of ozone and desperation. The KRYL medics were apoplectic, their antennae practically vibrating with outrage. Zyler, meanwhile, was torn between horror and morbid fascination that he knew he should intervene, but he couldn't tear his gaze away from the unfolding spectacle. IT was only when Jenkins attempted to cauterize the wound with a sparking power cell that Xyler finally snapped. "Private Jenkins," he shouted, his voice echoing through the engine room. "Stop! That is an order!" The resulting explosion, thankfully contained by the power cell's safety mechanisms, sent Jenkins sprawling and left the engine room smelling of burnt metal and singed hair. The KRYLL medics, seizing the opportunity, finally managed to wrestle Jenkins into a medkit and administer proper medical care. The incident, however, left a lasting impression on everyone involved, reinforcing the growing consensus that dealing with Terrans required a level of vigilance bordering on paranoia. The IT was after the Jenkins incident that Xyler received the official designation, Terran Contingent Liaison and Documentation Officer. The assignment came directly from the Admiralty, accompanied by a thinly veiled directive to mitigate potential disruptions. Xyler suspected that disruptions was code for galaxy-ending catastrophe. Xyler, a Xylarian of impeccable breeding and unwavering adherence to protocol, was, to put it mildly, not thrilled he had dedicated his life to the study of galactic diplomacy and the meticulous management of interspecies relations. His expertise lay in navigating complex treaties and resolving subtle cultural misunderstandings, not in wrangling a group of walking biological weapons with a penchant for self-inflicted injuries and questionable hygiene. He viewed the Terrans with a mixture of skepticism and thinly veiled annoyance. They were loud, boisterous, and seemingly incapable of following even the simplest instructions. Their casual disregard for personal safety bordered on the suicidal, and their constant stream of questions about everything from the Ethelgard's propulsion systems to the nutritional content of the recycled waste products was both exhausting and unnerving. Xyler considered himself a scientist, a scholar, a diplomat. He valued logic, reason, and order. The Terrans, on the other hand, seemed to operate on a chaotic blend of instinct, improvisation, and sheer dumb luck. He resented the assignment, the endless paperwork, the constant need to anticipate their next bizarre act of self-sabotage. He longed for the days when his biggest concern was negotiating trade agreements with the notoriously stubborn KRYLL or mediating disputes between the perpetually feuding Glimmering Ones. But Xyler was also a professional. He would fulfill his duty, document the Terrans' every move, and do his best to ensure that they didn't accidentally trigger a galactic war. But he just hoped, for the sake of his sanity, that the experience wouldn't leave him permanently scarred. The peacekeeping mission to the planet Viridia Prime was supposed to be a milk run, that a simple dispute between two indigenous species over water rights, easily resolved with a bit of diplomatic maneuvering and a show of force from the Concordant Armada. Xyler had even dared to hope for a day of relative tranquility. He should have known better. The problems began when the landing party, including Captain Rostova and her Terran contingent, encountered an unexpected phenomenon: localized pockets of highly corrosive atmospheric gas, a byproduct of Viridia Prime's unique geological composition. The gas rapidly dissolved the standard-issue Coalition protective suits, leaving the KRYLL warriors scrambling for cover and the Glimmering Ones emitting distressed bioluminescent pulses. The Terrans, however, seemed relatively unfazed. Rostova, after a quick assessment, barked out a series of orders. The Terrans, with surprising speed and efficiency, began improvising protective gear from their environment. They used salvage pieces of the dissolved protective suits, combined with native plant fibers and a sealant derived from the ship's emergency repair kits, to create makeshift respirators and protective coverings. Xyler watched in astonishment as the Terrans, seemingly immune to the corrosive effects of the gas, moved through the hazardous environment with a purposefulness that bordered on recklessness. They secured the perimeter, provided aid to the struggling Coalition troops, and even managed to rig up a temporary filtration system to clear a path for the diplomats. Their resourcefulness was remarkable, their bravery undeniable. Xyler, who had initially viewed them as a liability, began to see them in a new light. These were not just biological anomalies. They were survivors, capable of adapting to and overcoming challenges that would have crippled any other species in the Concordant. And as he watched them work, he couldn't help but wonder if their Death World origins had, In fact, made them uniquely suited for the unpredictable realities of peacekeeping operations. Back on the Ethelgard, Xyler found himself poring over his notes with a newfound sense of purpose. The Viridia Prime incident had shaken him, not just because of the near disaster, but because it had forced him to confront his own prejudices and preconceived notions about the Terrans. He began to meticulously document their problem-solving abilities, focusing on their capacity for improvisation and their seemingly innate understanding of engineering principles. He noted their ability to quickly assess a situation, identify the critical elements, and devise solutions using whatever resources were available, a skill he attributed to their Death World upbringing, where survival often depended on quick thinking and ingenuity. However, he also couldn't ignore their almost reckless disregard for personal safety. He documented instances where Terran soldiers willingly exposed themselves to danger, seemingly without a second thought, in order to achieve a mission objective or protect their comrades. That he noted their tendency to prioritize the task at hand over their own well-being, a trait that he found both admirable and deeply unsettling. He meticulously recorded every detail, from their choice of materials for makeshift repairs to their communication protocols during stressful situations. That he analyzed their movements, their expressions, their interactions with each other and with the environment. That he even started collecting samples of the materials they used for their improvised solutions, hoping to glean some insight into their thought processes. He began to see patterns in their behavior, a kind of underlying logic to their seemingly chaotic actions. They were not simply reckless. They were calculating, assessing risks and rewards with a speed and efficiency that was almost frightening. They were not simply improvising. They were applying a deep understanding of physics, chemistry, and engineering, honed by generations of surviving in a hostile environment. Xyler realized that he was no longer simply documenting the Terrans. He was studying them, trying to understand the secrets of their resilience, their adaptability, and their almost superhuman capacity for survival. And he began to suspect that these secrets might hold the key to the interstellar peacekeeping coalition's own future. The growing understanding of Terran capabilities did not, however, eliminate the persistent cultural clashes. If anything, it amplified them. As the coalition officers struggled to reconcile the Terrans' remarkable skills with their often baffling social behavior. Terran humor, for instance, was a constant source of confusion. Their fondness for sarcasm, irony, and self-deprecating jokes was completely lost on most coalition species. A KRYLL warrior, after being subjected to a particularly sarcastic remark from Private Miller, actually filed a formal complaint, accusing the Terran of insulting his honor and questioning his parentage. Their social customs were equally perplexing. The Terrans' habit of slapping each other on the back, engaging in playful insults, and engaging in physical contests of strength and agility was interpreted by some species as signs of aggression or dominance displays. The Glimmering Ones in particular were deeply offended by the Terrans' tendency to invade their personal space, a concept that was apparently alien to human culture. And then there was their attitude towards authority. The Terrans, while generally respectful of rank, seemed to have a natural aversion to blind obedience. They questioned orders, challenged assumptions, and frequently offered alternative solutions, even when they were explicitly told to follow protocol. This was seen as insubordination by some coalition officers. But Xyler began to realize that it was simply a reflection of their independent and resourceful nature. One memorable incident involved a Terran sergeant who, after being ordered to paint a storage compartment a specific shade of blue, decided to paint it a different shade of blue because he thought it looked better. The resulting argument, which involved several heated exchanges and a detailed explanation of the principles of color theory, ended with the sergeant being commended for his initiative and the storage compartment being repainted to his specifications. These cultural clashes, while often frustrating, were also a source of amusement, providing a much-needed dose of levity in the often grim atmosphere of the Ethelgard. As Xyler, despite his initial annoyance, found himself increasingly drawn to the Terrans' irreverent spirit and their willingness to challenge the status quo. He began to see that their cultural differences, while sometimes problematic, were also a source of strength, forcing the coalition to question its own assumptions and to consider new ways of thinking. The major crisis arrived in the form of a distress signal from a remote research outpost on the volatile moon of Tartarus 6 that a series of unexpected seismic events had triggered a cascade of cave-ins, trapping a team of scientists studying extremophile life forms. The moon's unstable geology, coupled with its toxic atmosphere and unpredictable weather patterns, made a rescue operation exceedingly dangerous. The coalition's best analysis predicted a less than 5% chance of survival for any rescue team. The KRYLL, with their armored exoskeletons, were the most physically suited for the task, but their rigid adherence to protocol and their aversion to risk made them hesitant. The glimmering ones, with their empathic abilities, could potentially locate the trapped scientists, but their delicate physiology made them vulnerable to the harsh environment. The decision was agonizing. The Admiralty debated for hours, weighing the lives of the trapped scientists against the potential loss of a rescue team. Finally, a compromise was reached. A remotely operated drone would be sent to assess the situation, but a manned rescue mission was deemed too risky. It was then that Captain Rostova stepped forward. "With respect, admirals," she said, her voice firm and unwavering, "we volunteer." A stunned silence filled the briefing room. Zyler stared at Rostova, his bioluminescent spectacles widening in disbelief. "Captain," he stammered, "are you certain? The odds of survival are minimal." Rostova nodded, her gaze unwavering. "We've faced worse besides," she added with a wry smile. "Someone has to bring those scientists home." The admirals exchanged uneasy glances. They knew the Terrans were resilient, resourceful, and perhaps even a little bit crazy. But this was beyond the pale. This was suicide. Yet, they couldn't deny the determination in Rostova's eyes, the unwavering confidence of her troops, and deep down, they knew that if anyone had a chance of succeeding, it was the Terrans of S.O., with a heavy heart and a silent prayer. They gave their assent. The Terran rescue mission to Tartarus 6 was officially underway. The descent to Tartarus 6 was a harrowing ordeal. The Terran shuttle, battered and patched together with spare parts, bucked and swayed through the turbulent atmosphere, buffeted by violent winds and bombarded by meteor showers. The automated systems issued constant warnings, but Rostova, with a grim smile, simply ignored them. Once on the surface, the Terrans faced a landscape of jagged rocks, bottomless crevasses, and pools of corrosive acid. The toxic atmosphere burned their lungs. Even through their protective gear, the seismic activity was constant, threatening to trigger further cave-ins at any moment. But the Terrans pressed on, their death world knowledge proving invaluable. They used their understanding of geology and engineering to predict unstable areas and navigate treacherous terrain. They employed their knowledge of chemistry to neutralize the corrosive acids and purify the air. They even used their knowledge of biology to identify edible plants and avoid dangerous wildlife. When they encountered a collapsed tunnel, they didn't waste time lamenting their misfortune. Instead, they used explosive salvage from the shuttle's emergency kit to blast a new entrance, carefully calibrating the charges to avoid triggering further collapses. When they needed to cross a chasm, they didn't wait for a transport vehicle. Instead, they constructed a makeshift bridge using salvaged metal plating, cables, and a healthy dose of duct tape. And when they were attacked by a swarm of ravenous, bioluminescent insects, they didn't panic. Instead, they used their knowledge of fire to create torches, driving the creatures back with flames and smoke. Zyler, monitoring the rescue operation from the Ethelgard, watched in awe and disbelief. The Terrans were not just surviving, they were thriving, adapting to the hostile environment with a level of ingenuity and resourcefulness that was simply astonishing. That it was as if their death world origins had given them a unique understanding of chaos and a preternatural ability to overcome any obstacle. Against all odds, the Terrans reached the research outpost. They found the scientists huddled together in a makeshift shelter, weakened but alive. The cave-ins had damaged the outpost's life support systems, and the scientists were running out of air. The Terrans, without hesitation, set about repairing the damage. They used their engineering skills to reroute power, their knowledge of chemistry to purify the air, and their sheer brute strength to reinforce the shelter against further collapses. They also discovered a previously undetected fault line that threatened to trigger a massive earthquake, one that could destabilize the entire moon. Rostova, after consulting with the scientists, made a daring decision. They would attempt to stabilize the fault line using a series of controlled explosions. The plan was incredibly risky, but it was their only hope. The Terrans worked tirelessly, planting the explosives with precision and care. They calibrated the charges to minimize the risk of triggering a larger quake, relying on their intuition and their understanding of seismic forces. The explosions rocked the moon, shaking the ground and sending tremors through the outpost. But when the dust settled, the fault line was stabilized. The earthquake had been averted. With the scientists safely secured and the outpost stabilized, the Terrans prepared for their ascent. They had faced death head-on, overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, and emerged victorious. Xyler, watching the Terran shuttle lift off from the surface of Tartarus 6, felt a surge of emotion he couldn't quite comprehend. Relief, gratitude, awe, and something else, something akin to respect. He had witnessed their true potential, their indomitable spirit, their unwavering commitment to saving lives. He realized that the Terrans were not just biological anomalies or walking weapons. They were something more, something extraordinary. They were the embodiment of hope, a testament to the power of resilience, ingenuity, and courage. And they had just saved the day against all odds, the Tartarus 6 rescue. Missions serve as a stark wake-up call for the Interstellar Peacekeeping Coalition. The initial emergency guidelines for dealing with Terran troops, once a source of amusement, were now viewed as woefully inadequate, almost insulting that a complete rewrite was ordered, one that took into account the Terrans' true capabilities and their unique approach to problem-solving. Xyler, now viewed as the resident expert on all things Terran, was invited to contribute his observations that he approached the task with a newfound seriousness, drawing on his meticulous notes and his growing understanding of human psychology. The revised guidelines were a far cry from the original. Gone were the naive platitudes about offering analgesics and avoiding questioning their dietary habits. In their place were detailed protocols for assessing Terran capabilities, leveraging their expertise in hazardous environments, and managing their inherent tendency towards recklessness. The new guidelines included sections on utilizing Terran engineering skills. Terrans possess an innate understanding of mechanics and engineering principles. When faced with a technological challenge, consult with Terran personnel before implementing standard coalition solutions. Harnessing Terran adaptability. Terrans are highly adaptable to a wide range of environmental conditions. They can be deployed in situations where other species would be unable to function effectively. Provide them with minimal resources and allow them to improvise solutions. Managing Terran risk-taking. Terrans have a high tolerance for risk and may engage in behaviors that other species consider dangerous. Monitor their activities closely, but avoid interfering unless there is a clear and imminent threat of death or serious injury. Remember, Terran assessment of risk may differ significantly from that of other species. Understanding Terran humor. Terran humor is often sarcastic, ironic, and self-deprecating. Do not take their remarks personally. If unsure whether a Terran is being serious, consult with another Terran or refer to the official Terran humor lexicon, Appendix 7. The revised guidelines also included a new section on Terran medical practices, which acknowledged their tendency to self-medicate with unconventional materials and strongly advised against it, unless under the direct supervision of a qualified Terran medic. The revised guidelines were a testament to the Terrans' impact on the Interstellar Peacekeeping Coalition. They were a recognition of their unique value, their remarkable capabilities, and their inherent capacity for chaos. And they were a clear indication that the galaxy would never be quite the same again. The revised guidelines were more than just a set of rules. They were a reflection of Xyler's own shift in perspective. He had begun to see the Terrans not as a problem to be managed, but as an asset to be utilized, a force to be reckoned with. He still found their behavior perplexing, their humor baffling, and their disregard for personal safety unnerving. But he also recognized their unwavering commitment to their mission, their extraordinary resourcefulness, and their deep-seated sense of camaraderie, as he began to understand that their death world origins had shaped them in ways that were both terrifying and awe-inspiring. They had learned to survive in a world that actively sought their extinction, and that survival had instilled in them a resilience, an adaptability, and a capacity for innovation that was unmatched by any other species in the Concordant. He realized that their chaotic nature was not a flaw, but a strength. Their ability to improvise, to adapt, to think outside the box was what allowed them to succeed in situations where others would have failed. Their willingness to take risks, to push the boundaries of what was possible, was what made them so effective in the face of danger. He even began to appreciate their humor, their sarcastic wit, and their self-deprecating jokes. He realized that it was their way of coping with the stresses of their job, of bonding with each other, of defusing tense situations. He still documented their every move, meticulously recording their actions and analyzing their behavior. But now, he did so with a sense of respect, a sense of admiration, and even a touch of affection. He had come to see the Terrans not as biological anomalies, but as individuals, each with their own unique strengths and weaknesses, their own quirks and eccentricities. And he had come to appreciate their value as allies, as partners in the quest for galactic peace. That he knew that they would never be easy to manage, that they would always be a source of chaos and disruption. But he also knew that they were the ones you wanted by your side when things went wrong, the ones you could count on to pull you through, no matter how dire the situation. The transformation in Zyler's perception of the Terrans was not an isolated phenomenon. Across the Ethelgard and throughout the Interstellar Peacekeeping Coalition, a similar shift was taking place. The initial apprehension and skepticism were gradually replaced by a grudging respect, and then by a genuine appreciation for the Terrans' unique capabilities. The KRYLL warriors, initially dismissive of the Terrans' lack of formal training and their disregard for protocol, began to observe their efficiency in combat and their unwavering loyalty to their comrades. They witnessed their willingness to take risks, to sacrifice themselves for the greater good, and they recognized in them a kindred spirit, a warrior ethos that transcended species and cultural differences. The Glimmering Ones, initially offended by the Terrans' boisterous behavior and their disregard for personal space, began to appreciate their honesty, their directness, and their unwavering commitment to justice. They saw in them a raw, untamed energy, a fierce determination to protect the innocent and to stand up for what was right. Even the Admiralty, initially concerned about the potential for chaos and disruption, began to recognize the strategic value of the Terrans' unique skills. They saw in them a force multiplier, a way to enhance the Coalition's peacekeeping capabilities and to respond more effectively to emerging threats. The Terrans were no longer seen as merely biological anomalies or walking weapons. They were now viewed as valuable assets, albeit ones requiring careful management. Their death world origins had forged them into something extraordinary, something that the Coalition could not afford to ignore. They were still subject to the emergency guidelines, still monitored closely by Zyler and his team. But now, the guidelines were seen as a tool for maximizing their effectiveness, not as a means of controlling their behavior. The Coalition had learned to embrace the Terrans' chaos, to harness their energy, and to channel their recklessness into productive endeavors. The galaxy had underestimated the Terrans, dismissing them as primitive and uncivilized. But now, they were beginning to see them for what they truly were, a force to be reckoned with, a species capable of anything, and a vital component of the Interstellar Peacekeeping Coalition. The moment of camaraderie came unexpectedly. During a rare period of downtime on the Ethelgard, the Terrans, having completed their assigned duties, had gathered in the mess hall, engaging in their usual boisterous banter and consuming vast quantities of a questionable beverage they referred to as coffee. Zyler, drawn by the noise and the lingering scent of caffeine, found himself standing hesitantly in the doorway, He had always maintained a professional distance from the Terrans, preferring to observe them from afar, to analyze their behavior with a detached scientific curiosity. But now he felt a strange compulsion to connect with them, to bridge the cultural gap that separated them. He took a deep breath and stepped into the mess hall. The Terrans, noticing his presence, immediately fell. Silent, Rostova, ever the gracious host, gestured towards an empty seat. "Officer Zyler, care to join us?" Zyler hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He sat down at the table, feeling a wave of self-consciousness wash over him. He was surrounded by Terrans, all of them staring at him with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. Rostova slid a mug of coffee towards him. "Try it. It'll put hair on your chest." Zyler cautiously took a sip. The beverage was bitter, acidic, and intensely stimulating. He grimaced, but forced himself to swallow. "It's interesting," he said, trying to maintain a neutral expression. The Terrans chuckled. Miller, the same private who had shrugged off the plasma burn, leaned forward with a mischievous grin. "Interesting is one word for it, that we also call it rocket fuel and liquid courage." The conversation flowed easily after that. The Terrans shared stories of their past adventures, recounting tales of daring missions, near-death experiences, and humorous mishaps. Zyler, initially hesitant, found himself drawn into their narratives, laughing at their jokes and marveling at their bravery. He even shared a few stories of his own, recounting his experiences negotiating trade agreements with the KRYLL and mediating disputes between the Glimmering Ones. The Terrans listened with rapt attention, peppering him with questions and offering their own unique perspectives. For the first time, Zyler felt like he was truly connecting with the Terrans, not as a scientist studying an alien species, but as a fellow being sharing a moment of camaraderie. That he realized that beneath their chaotic exterior, they were just like him. Individuals trying to make a difference in the galaxy, trying to do their part to maintain peace and order. And in that moment, he felt a sense of kinship, a sense of belonging that he had never experienced before. The integration of the Terrans into the Interstellar Peacekeeping Coalition was an ongoing experiment, a grand, chaotic endeavor that was still unfolding. The long-term consequences of their presence were difficult to predict, but one thing was certain. The Coalition would never be the same. The Terrans had forced the Coalition to confront its own complacency, to question its assumptions, and to reconsider its approach to peacekeeping. They had shown them that diplomacy and negotiation were not always enough, that sometimes you needed a force that was willing to take risks, to push the boundaries, and to fight for what was right. But the Terrans also posed a challenge to the Coalition's core values. Their inherent recklessness, their disregard for protocol, and their tendency towards violence threatened to undermine the Coalition's commitment to peaceful resolution and minimal force. The question was, could the Coalition integrate the Terrans without compromising its own principles? Could it harness their strengths without succumbing to their weaknesses? Zyler believed that it was possible, but it would require a delicate balance, a willingness to adapt, and a deep understanding of the Terran mindset. It would require the Coalition to embrace the chaos, to learn from their mistakes, and to find new ways to work together. That he knew that there would be setbacks, that there would be misunderstandings, and that there would be times when the Terrans' actions would test the Coalition's patience to the breaking point. But he also knew that the potential rewards were immense. The Terrans brought a new perspective, a new energy, and a new level of resilience to the Interstellar Peacekeeping Coalition. They were a force for change, a catalyst for innovation, and a reminder that even in the most tranquil of galaxies, there was always a need for a little bit of chaos. The future of the Coalition was uncertain, but one thing was clear. It would be a future shaped by the Terrans, for better or for worse. And Zyler, for one, was eager to see what that future would hold. He had a feeling it would be anything but boring. Zyler sat at his desk, the glow of his bioluminescent spectacles illuminating the final page of his report. IT had been a long and arduous journey, one that had tested his patience, his sanity, and his very understanding of the universe. He had started out as a skeptic, an outsider, an observer of the Terran madness, but he had ended up as something more, a witness to their extraordinary potential, a champion of their unique value, and Dare he admit it, a friend, he had documented their every move, analyzed their every action, and struggled to make sense of their chaotic nature. He had written countless reports, revised numerous guidelines, and spent countless hours trying to anticipate their next bizarre act of self-sabotage. But in the end, he had come to realize that the Terrans were not meant to be understood. They were meant to be experienced, to be embraced, and to be appreciated for their inherent capacity for surprise. He closed his report with a sense of satisfaction, a sense of accomplishment, and a sense of exhaustion that he knew that his work was far from over, that the Terrans would continue to challenge the Coalition's norms and to push the boundaries of what was possible. But he also knew that they were up to the task, that they had the resilience, the ingenuity, and the courage to face whatever the future might hold. He added one final guideline to the document, a rule that he felt encapsulated everything he had learned during his time with the Terrans. Expect the unexpected. He saved the report, filed it away, and then leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. He could still hear the echoes of their laughter, the scent of their coffee, and the memory of their unwavering commitment to each other and to their mission. He knew that he would never forget his time with the Terrans. They had changed him, challenged him, and ultimately made him a better officer, a better diplomat, and a better being. That he smiled, a rare and genuine expression of joy. The galaxy was a chaotic place, filled with danger, uncertainty, and endless possibilities. But with the Terrans by their side, the Interstellar Peacekeeping Coalition was ready to face whatever came their way. And Xyler, for one, was looking forward to the adventure.